The sound of strained machinery hung in the cold morning air like an unanswered question. On the far end of Fort Drake's armored vehicle yard, a behemoth of steel and firepower sat silent, its 70-ton frame an immovable monument to frustration. The M1A2 Abrams main battle tank, pride of the brigade, had been dead for nearly 6 hours. Its massive tracks were half buried in the frost-hardened mud, the long barrel of its 120mm cannon jutting uselessly toward the horizon. Steam curled lazily from the engine exhaust, not from power, but from the futile warmth of repeated failed start attempts. Around it, a cluster of soldiers and technicians stood in a loose semicircle, their breath fogging in the crisp November air. Portable diagnostic units were propped open, their screens flashing green lines and cryptic codes. Each reading seemed to say the same thing: no faults detected. But the machine wasn't moving. Staff Sergeant Cole Yates paced in front of the tank like a restless wolf. He was 32, built like a linebacker, with a jaw set in permanent irritation. His voice cut through the yard with the authority of a man who had more stripes on his sleeve than patience in his chest. "All right, people. We've done everything. Recalibrated the fuel injectors, reset the digital fire control system, drained and reprimed the hydraulics. This thing still thinks it's a brick." A few feet away, Private First Class Avery grinned at the small crowd of onlookers, mostly other crew members who'd been drawn in by the promise of a mechanical disaster. "Maybe it's just old and tired," Avery joked, nudging the side of the tank with the toe of his boot. "Like it wants to retire?" A ripple of laughter moved through the group, the kind of easy, mocking laughter soldiers fall back on when things are going wrong and pride is on the line. That's when someone noticed the man approaching from across the yard. He didn't belong. He wasn't in uniform. He wasn't carrying tools. And he wasn't moving with the clipped, purposeful stride of someone who had orders to follow. Instead, he walked with an unhurried, steady pace, hands in the pockets of a weathered leather jacket, a scarf tucked loosely around his neck. His hair was silver and unruly, his face carved with the deep lines of years lived fully. Arthur Bishop. Most of the soldiers didn't recognize him. To them, he was just another retiree who'd somehow wandered into the motor pool. His brown boots were scuffed and dusted with frost. He stopped a few paces from the tank and simply looked at it, his pale gray eyes scanning the massive vehicle with quiet intent. Cole caught sight of him and frowned. "Sir, this is a restricted area. You need to move back behind the barrier." Arthur didn't respond right away. His gaze lingered on the rear deck of the Abrams, the faintest narrowing of his eyes betraying some calculation. Then he looked at Cole. "What's the problem?" His voice was low, calm, almost conversational. Cole's frown deepened. "The problem is you being here. Now move along before I call base security." Avery smirked and crossed his arms. "What are you going to do, old man? Tap it with a cane until it runs?" That got another round of chuckles from the onlookers. The laughter was easy, dismissive, an attempt to keep the tension light. But it carried an edge. Arthur took another slow step toward the tank, his eyes never leaving it. "Sometimes," he said, "you don't need to fix the whole beast, just need to wake up the right part of it." Avery laughed louder. "Hear that? We've got ourselves a tank whisperer." Even Cole cracked a grin, though his tone was still sharp. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again. Step back." Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. It was about the size of a paperback book, darkened with age, the edges soft from years of handling. He unrolled it to reveal a set of tools, none of them standard issue, each of them shaped and worn in ways that suggested decades of use. The laughter around them swelled. Cole shook his head. "You're serious? Those things look like they came out of a museum." Arthur only gave the faintest shrug. "Sometimes museums have what you need." Somewhere deep in the tank's shadow, a hydraulic line groaned as cold wind swept over the yard. The sound seemed to catch Arthur's attention. his head tilting ever so slightly, like a musician hearing a sour note in an otherwise perfect score. He stepped forward again, closing the space between himself and the steel giant. And just like that, the laughter began to fade. As Arthur Bishop stopped in front of the tank, Cole Yates crossed his arms and narrowed his gaze. "Sir, this is a training ground. Civilian access is prohibited. Please stand down." Arthur's response was calm and measured. "I see the M1A2 isn't working. What's the problem?" Cole replied with a mixture of anger and sarcasm. "The problem is we can't get it to work, and the advice of veterans isn't the answer." A low chuckle rose from the soldiers behind. A young soldier named Avery stepped forward and asked, eliciting laughter, "Have you tried pushing the start button?" Arthur didn't laugh at all. His gaze wandered to the rear of the tank, toward the engine compartment. "How many hours has it been?" he asked. After a brief pause, Cole said, 6 hours. Arthur nodded, as if this information confirmed something he'd already guessed. "And the electronics are still showing no faults?" Cole looked surprised this time. "How do you know that?" Arthur simply shrugged. "Because I've heard those noises before." At that moment, Mark Danner, a young lieutenant officer, arrived on the scene. His breath steaming in the cold air, he asked sharply, "What's going on here?" Cole immediately replied, as if reporting, "Sir, the tank's not working. This civilian is trespassing. I'm warning him to leave." Danner turned his gaze to Arthur. "Your name?" "Arthur Bishop." Danner showed no reaction to the name, simply saying firmly, "Sir, this area is secure. You need to leave." One of the soldiers in the back said quietly but audibly, "Maybe we should give him a chance." Avery immediately snapped, "Luck? Are we going to wait for some old man to fix a 6-hour technical malfunction?" Arthur ignored the young soldier's words and approached the tank's engine compartment. He put his ear close to the metal surface, his fingers pressed against the cold steel. He felt a slight vibration. "The electronics are fine." "Nerves," he said. Cole frowned. "What are you talking about?" Arthur pulled a small, curved, unusual wrench from his leather toolbox. "You're focusing on the ECU, but the problem is the hydraulic pressure bypass valve. It sticks in the cold, especially on this model. There's no way you can tamper with this device," Danner said sternly. But Arthur's eyes remained fixed on the tank, as if he'd reached the final stage of a plan. Over the howl of the cold wind, the distant sounds of motor vehicles could be heard. When the soldiers turned to look, 3 black SUVs were approaching rapidly. Cole's face fell. "Commander is coming," he said. The SUVs braked sharply and stopped just in front of the tank. The doors opened simultaneously, and Brigadier General Harris emerged with heavy strides. With him was Colonel Monroe, the commander of the Armored Brigade, and several other senior officers. The soldiers' expressions changed instantly. Those who had been jeering a moment ago were now silent. Harris walked wordlessly to Cole, his gaze locked on Arthur Bishop. "Bishop?" he asked, his voice both bewildered and clearly authoritative. Cole was taken aback. "Do you know him, sir?" Harris, as if he hadn't heard Cole's question, approached Arthur and saluted firmly. "I'm honored, Mr. Bishop. It's unexpected, but welcome to see you here." The surrounding soldiers' eyebrows raised. Even Danner couldn't hide his surprise. Harris turned to Cole and said coldly, "Let no one stop this man from coming to the tank. You will listen to his instructions now." Cole involuntarily stepped back. Harris continued, "Most of you don't know, but Bishop is an engineer who worked on field prototypes of the M1A2s this brigade uses, operating them countless times in the field. He's the one who pulled 3 tanks out of action near Basra, Iraq. While you're looking at a computer screen, he can tell the problem from the engine vibration." The soldiers' gazes weren't mocking, they were wary. Harris stepped back. "Mr. Bishop, you're in charge." Arthur pulled a curved wrench from his bag. "Just make some room," he said. He approached the maintenance panel on the tank's side. He began loosening the screws quickly and decisively. The cold air left a thin mist on the metal, revealing a tangled tangle of pipes and wiring. "There it is," he said, tapping the valve. "It's stuck. The ECU won't detect it, but if the pressure doesn't flow through here, you're not going anywhere." Avery swallowed, suppressing his earlier sarcasm. "So, just a valve?" Arthur glanced briefly. "In battle, the smallest thing makes all the difference." He carefully turned the valve with the wrench, and a small click was heard. He closed the panel, climbed onto the tank, opened the driver's hatch, and told the personnel inside, "Try again." Sergeant Morales, sitting in the driver's seat, looked into Arthur's eyes for a moment, then turned the key. On the first try, a deep, familiar but long unheard growl rose from the tank. Black smoke billowed from the exhaust pipe in the cold air, then the rhythmic, powerful roar of the engine filled the entire space. Within seconds, the massive hull began to vibrate slightly. Systems within the turret were activating one by one, hydraulic lines revving to life. The expressions on the soldiers' faces changed rapidly. Surprise, awe, a touch of shame. Avery parted his lips, but couldn't find the words. Cole, frozen, watched the tank roar to life. Arthur slowly climbed out of the tank, listening to the engine rumble and nodding with satisfaction. "Sometimes it's not complicated," he said, "but you have to know the right place." Harris stepped forward and patted Arthur on the shoulder. "Bishop, you're still a master of your craft. The brigade will remember this moment." The surrounding soldiers gathered involuntarily, as if they had suddenly seen the man they had so scorned on a page in a history book. Morales stuck his head out of the driver's seat and smiled. "Sir, this tank is ready for battle." Arthur simply replied, "Then don't waste any time." The tank began to move slowly, its tracks squeaking on the icy ground as everyone followed it with their eyes. The powerful roar of the engine completely obliterated the silence of a moment before. Cole stepped shyly up to Arthur. "I think I owe you one," he said quietly. Arthur shook his head. "Not me, the machine. Respect it, and it will reciprocate." As Harris and the other officers walked with Arthur, the soldiers' looks were completely different now. No mockery, just silent respect. As the tank pulled away out of sight, all that remained was the echo of the engine and the howl of the cold wind. As the soldiers slowly dispersed, Cole, Avery, and a few others remained behind. Their expressions still held the impact of the earlier scene. Cole, his eyes lowered, said, "What just happened was like a story I've read in books." Avery remained silent. His earlier sarcasm had completely vanished, replaced by a kind of regret. Arthur slung his pack over his shoulder and came to stand beside Harris. The brigadier general said with a slight smile, "Bishop, moments like these are memorable. Everyone here learned a different lesson today." Arthur nodded, his voice low but clear. "Respect for machinery begins with respect for people. Everyone who builds, operates, and maintains equipment is a link in the chain. If one of those links is weak, the chain breaks." Harris patted his shoulder in affirmation. "You're right, as always." Arthur took a step back, his eyes flickering briefly in the direction of the tank. "Sometimes," he told himself, "a battlefield isn't on the ground. It's in the hearts of men." Cole mustered his courage and took a step forward. "Mr. Bishop, if you'll allow it, someday I'd like you to explain that valve to me in detail." Arthur smiled slightly. "When that day comes, you'll understand not just the valve, but the whole system." Then he stuffed his hands into his pockets and walked away silently. As the wind gently blew the hems of his leather jacket, one impression remained. Arthur Bishop, once a legendary figure on the battlefield, was still a master who knew when to stop and when to act. And today everyone at Fort Drake had seen firsthand what that mastery looked like.